The laughter started before Danny Fenwick even reached the general store steps. "Look at that coat," one of the older boys called out, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Bet his mama sewed it out of a feed sack." Another boy snatched at the frayed cuff, and Danny yanked his arm back, his face burning red beneath the dust of the road. The coat had belonged to his father, patched twice at the elbow, the collar gone thin as paper, and it was the only one he owned. He kept his eyes on his boots, the way he always did when the words came, as if looking down could make him disappear. In his pocket, as always, was a scrap of paper where he'd been sketching horseshoe patterns, copying the shapes his father used to hammer out at the forge. It was the one thing that made him feel close to a man he barely remembered. Across the street, Louisa Fenwick froze mid-step, a basket of mending pressed to her hip. She had heard it too. Her jaw tightened, but before she could cross the road, a tall man in a gray wool coat, already leaning against the hitching post outside the bank, straightened up and watched the boy's shoulders curl inward. His name was Reuben Cole, and he was, by any account the county could give, a millionaire, cattle, land, and holdings scattered across 3 territories, though half the men who owed him favors had never once heard him mention a figure. He said nothing. He only watched, and something in his stillness made 2 of the boys stop laughing before they understood why. If you believe a child should never have to feel small for wearing what his family can afford, stay with me to the end of this one. Subscribe for stories where quiet men do loud things, and tell me in the comments what town, state, or country you're watching from tonight. Reuben crossed the street without hurrying. He didn't scold the boys, didn't raise his voice. He simply stopped beside Danny, looked at the coat as though it were the finest garment in Prairie Hollow, and said, "That's a blacksmith's stitch on that collar. Only man I ever knew who could sew a seam that tight was a smith who worked leather aprons for a living." Danny blinked up at him, startled. "My pa was a blacksmith," he said quietly. "He made that coat's collar himself, from apron leather, before he died." Reuben nodded slowly, as if he'd expected exactly that answer, and then he did something that silenced the boys who'd been laughing only a moment before. He took off his own coat, folded it, and set it in Danny's arms. "Hold this a minute for me, would you? A man in my line of work needs someone he can trust to mind his things." It wasn't charity. It wasn't a rescue. It was something else entirely, and even Louisa, hurrying up behind her son, couldn't tell what. She had heard of Reuben Cole, everyone in the county had. He'd come to Prairie Hollow 8 months back with more cattle than any 3 ranchers combined, bought out old Simmons's failing spread for a fair price when he could have taken it for nothing, and never once flaunted the wealth folks whispered about. He kept to himself. He asked more questions than he answered, and now he was standing in the street with her son's dead husband's coat draped over one arm, looking at her the way a man looks at something he's trying hard not to stare at. "Mrs. Fenwick," he said, tipping his hat, "your boy's got a sharp eye, recognized my horse's shoe before I said a word about it, says he wants to shape one himself someday." Danny flushed with pride this time, not shame. Louisa thanked him stiffly, gathered her son, and walked on, but she felt Reuben's gaze follow them the length of the street, and she wondered, not for the first time that year, how much longer she could keep the truth of their circumstances hidden from a town that only saw a widow and a boy in a patched coat, and never the ledger book that kept her awake past midnight. That ledger was the real trouble. Thomas Fenwick had borrowed against his forge 2 winters before his accident, a modest loan from Prairie Hollow's only bank to buy new tools and expand into wagon repair. Horace Griggs, the bank's owner and the most trusted man in town outside the church, had structured the note personally, signing the original terms himself 2 years before Thomas's death. Since Thomas's death, Louisa had scraped together every payment through mending and laundry, determined never to miss one, never to give Griggs cause to say a she. Widow couldn't keep her word. But 3 months ago, the payments had stopped covering the balance no matter how much she sent. The debt was growing instead of shrinking, and Griggs's explanations, a revised interest clause, a clerical adjustment, terms she didn't remember agreeing to, left her with more questions than answers and no lawyer in 3 counties willing to challenge the man who held half the town's mortgages. She hadn't told Danny how close they were to losing the forge and the small house behind it. She hadn't told anyone. She hadn't even told her closest neighbor, Mrs. Abbott, who'd once hinted that her own family's grazing rights had been recalculated by the bank the year prior, in terms she never fully understood and never dared to question aloud. Reuben, it turned out, already suspected something was wrong. He began appearing at odd, unremarkable moments, buying nails he didn't need at the mercantile when Louisa was there settling her account, offering to haul lumber past her gate on his way to nowhere in particular. He never mentioned money. He asked about Thomas instead, about the forge, about what kind of man built a coat collar sturdy enough to survive 2 winters of a growing boy's rough handling. Louisa found herself talking more than she intended, and found, too, that she didn't entirely mind it. "You're not doing this out of pity," she said to him one afternoon, watching him mend a fence rail with more skill than a rich man had any business having. "Men like you don't spend afternoons on other people's fences for nothing." Reuben set down his hammer. "When I was younger than your Danny," he said, "my father lost our farm in Missouri to a note holder who changed the terms after the ink dried. Told my father he owed triple what he'd agreed to, and there wasn't a court in the county that would hear a poor man's word against a banker's ledger. My father worked himself into an early grave, trying to pay a debt that was never real to begin with." He looked toward the forge, dark and cold behind Louisa's house. "When I traced the man responsible here to Prairie Hollow 8 months ago, I told myself I'd only come to be certain. I didn't expect to find a whole town caught the same way my father was." Louisa's breath caught. "You think Griggs is doing the same thing to me?" "I think," Reuben said carefully, "that in every transaction that's touched Horace Griggs's bank since I arrived, I've kept my own copies of every paper he's drawn up. Men like that get careless when they believe no one's watching closely enough to compare one contract to another. And I think your Mrs. Abbott isn't the only neighbor of yours who's lost grazing rights or fallen behind on a debt that kept growing no matter how much she paid." It was the first time she let herself hope, and the first time she let herself notice how steady his hands were, how he'd said your boy instead of the boy, as though Danny already mattered to him the way a person mattered, not a stranger's misfortune to be solved and forgotten. Their closeness didn't sit well with everyone. Griggs himself called on Louisa the following week, all courtesy and cold eyes, warning her that outside interference in bank business could sour the goodwill he'd shown her family. "I've been patient with your payments, Mrs. Fenwick," he said, "on account of respect for your late husband. I'd hate for that patience to run thin." It was the closest thing to a threat a respectable man could make without saying the word aloud, and Louisa understood it perfectly. Within days, 2 of her steadiest mending customers quietly stopped bringing their baskets, murmuring apologies they couldn't quite explain, and Louisa understood that too. Griggs had reached far beyond his bank's front door. That night, searching through Thomas's old toolbox for a chisel to fix a hinge, she found a folded paper tucked beneath a false bottom, a page in her husband's careful hand, the original terms of the forge loan, bearing Griggs's own signature from 2 years before Thomas's death. The interest rate on that page was nearly half what Griggs now claimed the family owed. She rode to Reuben's ranch before sunrise, the paper folded against her chest the whole way, half afraid the ink might somehow vanish before she arrived. He read the page twice, then set it beside a stack of contracts of his own. Cattle deals, land transfers, all bearing Griggs's signature and a clause, buried in dense language near the bottom that quietly doubled the stated interest after the 2nd year. It was the same wording, nearly word for word, that had stolen his father's farm in Missouri 20 years before. "He's done this to more than your family," Reuben said quietly. "He's done it to mine, and to your neighbors, and likely to men in this county who never thought to compare their paper against anyone else's." For a moment neither of them spoke, and Louisa realized that what she felt for him had grown far past gratitude. It frightened her more than the debt did. Griggs, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, moved faster than either of them expected. He filed for foreclosure on the forge within the week, set an auction date for the following Saturday, and quietly pressured Louisa's remaining customers to take their business elsewhere until her income dried to almost nothing. Worse, he let it be known around town that the widow Fenwick had fallen behind through carelessness, that her boy's shabby coat was proof enough of a household in decline. The whispers reached Danny at school. He came home with his knuckles scraped from a fight he refused to explain, his father's coat torn further at the shoulder, and told his mother he never wanted to wear it again. "It's not the coat that's shameful," Louisa told him that night, mending the tear by lamplight with hands that shook from more than exhaustion. "It never was. Your father built things to last, Danny. That includes you." Reuben spent the 2 days before the auction writing to every family he suspected Griggs had wronged, gathering names, dates, and quiet nods of confirmation, Mrs. Abbott among them, her hands trembling as she finally admitted what she'd long suspected, but never dared say aloud. On the morning of the auction, he rode not toward the forge, but toward the county recorder's office 2 towns over, carrying Louisa's original loan page, his own father's 20-year-old file, and a sworn statement from a retired bank examiner who'd once worked beside Griggs and had long suspected the altered clauses without proof enough to act. He returned just as the crowd gathered outside the bank, Griggs already reading the auction notice aloud from the front steps, with the satisfied calm of a man who believed the matter settled. It would be said afterward, up and down the roads of the territory, that a millionaire cowboy had once heard them mock a widow's son's old clothes, and that his next move silenced everyone who'd ever doubted her. Reuben walked through the crowd without a word, set the county recorder's certified findings on the steps in front of Griggs, and asked him, in a voice that carried to every corner of the street, to explain why the interest clause in Louisa Fenwick's loan didn't match the clause her late husband had signed, and why that same altered language appeared in contracts belonging to no fewer than 6 other families in the county, going back further than Griggs likely wanted anyone to count. The street fell utterly silent. Griggs said nothing at all, his face draining of color as the county recorder himself stepped forward from the crowd to confirm the findings were genuine, filed, and already forwarded to the territorial court. It wasn't shouting or violence that beat him, it was proof, laid plainly in front of the very people who trusted him most, and it was Reuben's willingness to spend 2 days riding from house to house, gathering the courage of neighbors too frightened to speak alone, that had made the proof undeniable. By the time the sheriff arrived to escort Griggs to answer for the forged terms, the auction had been canceled, the forge secured, and Louisa stood with her hand pressed to her mouth, unable to speak. Reuben didn't make a speech. He simply turned to Danny, standing beside his mother in the torn coat he'd sworn never to wear again, and said, "Your father built that coat to last. Seems to me it just proved him right." In the weeks that followed, Louisa reopened the forge under her own name, training a young apprentice from town while Danny finally shaped his first horseshoe under her guidance, no longer lowering his eyes when he walked past the boys who'd once mocked him. Louisa mended the coat's shoulder herself, using a strip of leather from Thomas's old apron so that the garment carried both her husband's hands and her own. Danny wore it proudly through the whole of that autumn, showing anyone who'd looked the horseshoe he'd made, the coat's torn shoulder now stitched tighter than it had ever been. Reuben stayed in Prairie Hollow. He and Louisa took to walking the fence line most evenings, no longer needing an excuse of loose rails or spare nails, and the town that once whispered about a widow's hardship began, slowly, to whisper instead about a wedding they suspected was coming, sooner or later, whenever 2 careful, guarded people finally admitted what half the county already knew. The lesson of it lingered long after the gossip faded, that on the frontier, a family's worth was never measured in the clothes on a boy's back, but in the truth a mother refused to let bury her, and the courage of anyone willing to stand beside her and say so out loud.